On the night he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, saying, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same manner, after supper he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." The Eucharist is an important element of Christian worship, an act full of mystery and celebration. It is called by many names and is viewed differently among Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant churches, yet all agree upon its importance and original significance. Though the Eucharist centers on Jesus and his death as atonement for sin, it is rooted in the traditions of the Jewish people and the feast of the Passover. It was during the Passover that Jesus celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples, and it was this earlier feast that first called God's people to reflect upon the story of redemption.
The Christian gospel is rooted in what God has done, breaking into history to save a people that he calls out for himself. So why is it important then for worship to be connected to redemptive history? Because that's what the gospel is about. In Israel's history, their worship was connected to the saving events. So you look at the feasts in Israel's history, like Passover. Well, that was the night when the lamb was slaughtered and the blood was put on the doorposts. And so they celebrated Passover to remind themselves of that.
The central celebration for Christians in this early church, the coming together around the Lord to do in memory of Jesus what Jesus did with his disciples at what we call the Last Supper, is one of the earliest structures that we have. In fact, our supper structure of word and table dates at least in a ritual form that's identifiable to mid-2nd century, if not earlier. The Last Supper itself was no doubt a Jewish festal meal, and some of those words and actions continue these many thousands of years later in our own Christian observances.
In the New Testament book of 1 Corinthians, we find the first clues as to how different names developed for the Christian celebration of the table feast. The Apostle Paul uses the phrases communion, Lord's Supper, and Eucharist to describe the same event. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul refers to the cup and bread as the communion of Christ. In chapter 11, he states that Christians gather together to eat the Lord's Supper, and that on the night Jesus was betrayed, Christ took bread and gave thanks. The Greek word for gave thanks is Eucharistio, from which we derive the English word Eucharist. Whether we call it communion, the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, the sacred meal is just that, believers breaking bread together with Christ at the center.
From the time of the early church, the central act, the act that continually by God's grace through Christ and the Spirit constituted, recreated and renewed the life of the church was the Eucharist, which is a great thanksgiving, the celebration of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the triumph of God over sin, evil, and death.